I think that we're having a very profound and deep discussion. And I think that what I'm, based on the videos that you brought up, Michael, and that is this, our conscious mind's need to create these categories is the very nature of what creates power.
All right, everybody. I just want to welcome everybody to another of our series on Anarchapulco 24/7, 365. We're talking about human potential, and today we've got Jonny Dupre and Bob Podolsky with us. Sterling Lujan couldn't make it. He's prepping for Anarchadelphia, and so he's going to be absent. But today we're going to be talking primarily about neuro-linguistic programming and kind of the applications into human potential. But let's just get started with somebody want to describe NLP and kind of give us a little bit of background on NLP. Bob, do you want to start with that or?
I don't care. I could start.
Okay.
Sure. Well,
tell us a little bit about NLP.
NLP was an invention by John Grinder and Richard Bandler. Grinder is or was a fantastic linguist, Bandler a programmer. And the two of them studied three amazing psychotherapists who are very, very effective, Fritz Perls and Virginia Satir and Milton Erickson. And although these three high performance people have very different styles, there's a common thread that runs through the work that each of them does, commonalities in what they do. And Grinder and Bandler were able to recognize those commonalities and combine them into what they called neuro-linguistic programming. So it's really a compendium, if you will, of very specific behaviors used by these three outstanding therapists in order to help people change their lives. And it's extremely effective. I first noticed this technology in 1979 by reading a book. And the book is still, in my opinion, one of the very best books for beginners in this field. It's called Frogs into Princes. And the underlying idea is when the princess kisses the frog, it magically becomes a prince. And the reason for that metaphor is simply that when you use this technology and people's lives change, it seems almost like magic. It's really quite remarkable. And that book captures that spirit of that, I think, very well. So there are many more detailed books written on the subject. I didn't get any formal training in it for the first year that I knew about it. I was using it as a counselor for a year before I actually joined a training program with John Grinder and spent 6 months under his tutelage learning the fine points of the technology as it existed back then. This was 1980. There's been a lot of development since then. And from my perspective, which is admittedly a little bit biased, I haven't found it useful to follow the unfolding developments in that field because the work that I was exposed to back in 1980 was so effective that I just, for the most part, have kept using techniques that I learned directly from John Grinder and his brother. So that's my high altitude overview of this technology. And Jonny, I'm sure you've got stuff to say about your perspective on it.
Well, I'm going to say this, Bob. That's a great synopsis, especially since knowing that NLP and the definition of NLP has been such an interesting conversation, debate, and discussion over the last several decades as to what it precisely means, which is it's a great prompt. I unfortunately wasn't alive in 1979, which I would have loved to have been, during the inception of the technology, it would have been absolutely amazing. But unfortunately, I was born in 1980. And so I didn't have the opportunity to actually come face to face with the technology until 1992. And so I would consider myself to be second generation or even third generation as a practitioner of the technology. And unfortunately for me, that I don't like to come up with the definition of neuro-linguistic programming, and here's why. When you come up with the definition of it, I, by my own subjective reality, end up having to define it from my own experience, which then violates the concept of, in my opinion, what NLP stands for, which is sort of a technology that allows you to understand and connect with how another individual shapes their own reality, their own subjective reality, through language, their neurology, and a set of strategies that are formed as a result of the connection between the systems, the two systems that Daniel Kahneman speaks about in Thinking Fast and Slow, which for me, we identify in that field as the conscious and the unconscious, or the conscious and the subconscious, depending upon how you choose to label it. And so for me, there is us as a species. One of the two biggest things for me that separates us from the rest of our mammalian cousins is our ability to have these two systems. And as a result of that, the power of language and our ability to communicate or express our reality, our subjective reality from one person to another. The second of which, for me, is our ability to have what I call meta-awareness. And this is something that they speak about a lot in NLP, is that we as a species aren't just aware of the fact that there is an experience going on that we are a part of, we're also aware that we're aware. And we're also aware of the fact that we're aware of what we're aware of. And as a result of that set of meta-awareness can go ad infinitum. So it can continue to be layered for an infinite number of layers, depending upon the level of conversation and consciousness that you bring to that communication and conversation. And so for me, NLP, Bob perfectly created a synopsis of its history based on how it was created. But there were a lot of other individuals that got involved with Grinder and Bandler at the beginning of its inception that then contributed to its creation. And from the Andreases played a huge role in my eyes with core transformation work. And obviously we could spend the next 20 minutes on this call going through all of the people that contributed to it. But for me, NLP's definition really is the study of reality. It's the study of subjective reality and the ability to set the intention towards shaping, shifting, and changing that reality. And so I agree with Bob completely that it is probably one of the most, if not the most efficient ways of creating change. But I have a little tweak on it, and that is only if trance is present, which is you need to allow an unconscious component to be present in the experience. Otherwise, you're only talking to one of the systems, or you're only addressing one of the systems. And without bridging that gap between system 1 and system 2, or conscious and unconscious, I've seen NLP be not as effective with certain people. So that's sort of my take on it too.
May I respond?
Awesome.
Lee, yeah, I would love to hear Bob's response.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, well, I have spoken with many, many practitioners of NLP, and what I have seen is that the area where NLP practice is the weakest has to do with the understanding of, okay, now I'm able to bridge some of the gaps between us. I recognize that when two people are talking, there are 6 channels of communication active. Conscious to conscious, subconscious to subconscious, conscious to subconscious, subconscious to conscious, and my own conscious and subconscious and yours. That's 6 channels of communication between any two people. Now, and by the way, the thing that you call awareness of awareness, I call that consciousness. That's the way I define consciousness. But anyway, so, okay, now we have tools, a tool bag of ways that one can communicate through these 6 channels and get extraordinary results in doing so. The question becomes, do we have sufficient understanding of what results are needed and what are the current obstacles to those results? Why hasn't the transformation already taken place? And what I have found is that among skilled practitioners, the most consistent lack has been an understanding of exactly what kind of change do you want to make or induce in the relationship between another person's conscious and subconscious. What's worth doing, in other words? To fill that gap in my practice, I've used several other methodologies, principally the understanding of character structure as explicated by Alexander Lowen, and one can spend a whole, you can spend a week easily studying, you know, what the changes he went through in creating today's model of character structure. But basically, character structure is the thing we learn to do when we're infants and toddlers in order to avoid certain experiences that were unpleasant. In other words, to hide from ourselves what our experience actually was. And so the result of that is that so often the conscious mind and the subconscious mind of an individual are at odds with each other. There's conflict. And it is the resolution of that conflict that I find the most helpful when it comes to inducing positive changes in other people conversationally. Ideally, we want the conscious and the subconscious to align with each other and harmonize with each other so that we're cooperating. And what I have found is that when through the neuro-linguistics, when we achieve that, extraordinarily wonderful things happen in people's lives. And to me, watching other people benefit from what we do is the most rewarding thing. You know, I spent many years doing theoretical physics and never, ever, ever saw another human being benefit from what I was doing directly. Never. But the moment I became a psychotherapist, I got to have that experience every day. I get to see people benefiting from what we do. And this is why I'm still to this day really excited about the technology that lets us bring people into a state of honesty with themselves, where they're no longer conflicted the way they were. That doesn't mean that all the conflicts disappear, just the really important ones. And we can identify those. And I think that's a really important part of the new technology, is that ability to identify, okay, if I can induce change in you, what change do you need? How do we define it? How do we recognize it? And then how do we address it? Jonny, would you agree with what I've said?
Yeah, I think it has to do with, I think obviously coming at it from a place of intention, outcome, and directionality for the individual, what they ultimately want, what they ultimately see within them on any level that is a desire of theirs, that being able to have not just the technology to communicate what's needed to create change, but a structure by which to help them identify the most important place to begin that change. Call it a route to their structure, I think is pivotal. So I agree with you completely, Bob.
Thank you.
Specifically, I wanted to kind of identify Robert Dilt's work in the logical levels and the idea of the conscious mind acting as the filter for the subconscious mind. What do you guys, in regard to the logical levels, What's your guys' feeling on that? And can you give me a little bit of background on that?
Jonny, you go first this time.
Yeah, I have a bit of a different take on it because I'm studying neuroscience, and we know a lot about the brain now, way more now than we knew back in the time when Dilts actually came up with the logical levels. But I'm going to speak to my own interpretation of that, or this will sound like just one long neuroscience conversation, which is not going to benefit, I think, the listeners anywhere near as much as we'd like it to. And my take is this: both systems, conscious and subconscious, or conscious and unconscious, I believe are watching the back of the other one. Because by their nature, they don't have the same capabilities or the same mechanisms built in the brain. So at the root of our, let's call it our initial system, we have to be able to survive. And so our unconscious or subconscious mind's ultimate job is our survival. And it looks at the holistic. It looks at the whole picture and says, I have access to 400 billion bits of information per second. And so I look at everything that's happening all at the same time. And it sees it all as one unified present right now. This is what's occurring in this moment. Versus, from my perspective, the executive order or higher functioning, which is the big prefrontal cortex and neocortex that sort of can rip things apart. It can compartmentalize. It can break down. It can say, it can set up procedures and processes. It creates time and says, I can look into a makeshift or imaginary future, which we're not certain exists, and according to actual science, doesn't exist yet. And can predict, it can plan, it can attempt to design a way of moving that isn't necessarily available right now, but could become available if I take these certain set of steps. And so I believe both of these systems serve each other, which is, yes, it's important that in this moment I be present to everything that's occurring and look at everything in a holistic, wholesome point of view. And yet there is a power to being able to plan and predict, which of course the mechanism is a prediction correction mechanism. And so as a result of that, we need to be able to navigate those two things. And so I believe that the logical levels, I don't believe that the conscious mind only acts as a filter for the unconscious, but I also believe that the unconscious mind is giving to the conscious mind the information it needs in order to filter that. And so I don't believe that we can actually separate them and say that one holds dominion over the other. I think that that's an isolation or a compartmentalized point of view. And as of this moment in time, we don't even have neuroscience to prove the mind even exists. So we know that a brain is there and we know that there's information processing, but we can't prove there is a mind per se. So that right there is a diagram or a map or a perspective or a frame we place on this active experience we're having. So for me, I don't know necessarily from my own experience if the logical levels are even able to be proved per se. So that's my take on it. Bob?
Well, I'm delighted hearing what you're saying. I frankly have never studied Dilt's work, so I don't know his logical levels. But I do know this. I do know that the conscious and subconscious minds work together. You know, the brain is one thing, even though you can break it down into 8 different sections. You've got the fish brain, the reptile brain, the mammal brain, and the neocortex. And you've got them on the left and on the right, and the left and right aren't the same. And so therefore, each of us has 8 brains working together. Imagine 8 CPUs in a computer linked up together. So I like thinking of the brain in those terms some of the time. And I'm quite clear that the information that comes to my conscious mind has already passed through the subconscious. Why? Because all of my nerve endings that bring me sensory data plug into the subconscious part of the brain, autonomic and all that. And then some portion of that gets selected out to be in the conscious mind. So in a sense, it's the subconscious filtering what gets to the conscious mind. But then there's there's a conscious process that is a further filtering, where you take this massive amount of information collected from the subconscious and narrow it down to whatever it is you're paying attention to right now. So both parts filter each other in different ways, as far as I can see. That's my opinion. When I use the word opinion, by the way, I'm talking about something I believe that I have yet to prove.
Now, Michael, I'm going to jump in because I'm going to wrap what I said and what I believe Bob is saying back into the logical levels into Dilts, and that is this.
Right.
Okay.
If we have a conscious mind and it likes to rip things apart and it likes to label and it likes to categorize and it likes to segment things off, then it would make sense to come up with a map that segments our experience. And if you look at the logical levels, it's sort of going from external to most internal, or from concrete to the most abstract. Okay? And that is, it starts with the root of the environment, right? And that root of the environment, we believe, this is interesting, we believe is objective. We believe it's objective. Like whether or not Bob exists or I exist or you exist, that tree would still be there. There would still be heat coming from the sun. This is what we believe to exist. But if we get philosophical, we don't actually know that, because there needs to be something that measures that reality in order for us to even determine whether or not the environment exists. Now we're getting at topics about the matrix and are we actually living in a virtual reality right now, and we're all being given the data, but there is no actual environment. We're plugged into a machine right now. And that's like a big, huge rabbit hole we could go down. But let's assume that an environment exists. Then that means that Bob, you, and I can be standing in the same room and see the same thing and hear the same thing, feel the same heat, tactily, not interoceptive feelings, not within us, but what's going on tactily outside of us. Our smell and gustatory. So our 5 senses. Okay, now I believe there's a 6th sense, which is awareness. And it's our awareness of these other 5 things. But that goes more to what Bob and I were talking about a second ago. Okay, so from that environment, we receive information, input, concrete data. Okay, but then the next layer it touches, according to Dilt's logical levels, is that of behavior, which is what is our doingness with that information. So a dog walks by and the dog looks at me. That is what's happening in the environment. However, what I do with that information, it leads to the next logical level, which is my behavior. Do I pet the dog? Do I look at the dog? Do I turn away from the dog? Does my breathing alter as a result of the dog's presence? What is my level of behavior there? Okay, what will I do differently, say differently, act differently as a result of that stimuli, that trigger, that information? The next level up in the logical levels is capabilities, which is how do I perceive my ability to take behaviors? How can I interact with that? How do I have all of these different options available to me or choices available to me that I can execute a behavior in that environment? Well, how do you determine what your capabilities are? Well, Dilt says that that's based on your values, or what I call your virtues, and your beliefs. Well, that's a little bit more abstract. Now, how does one measure values? It's kind of an abstract concept. And that leads, of course, to how one identifies one's own personality. What's my identity? Okay, which is the next step up on Dilt's logical levels. Okay, and eventually Dilt speaks about purpose. Okay, well, didn't Bob and I just talk about the intention one has, the desire one has as an important critical component to how we can use technologies like NLP and of a multitude of other technologies to help people make transformational changes. And so those are sort of the logical levels. But what I want to draw everyone's attention to as they're listening now is that that is just a map of human experience. It is a way of measuring the different aspects or qualities of the human experience, but it is not the way. And that's the beauty of having a multitude of psychological theorists and new technologies that are coming out and new neuroscience and people like us having conversations like this, is that that can lead to an innovation in new maps. But let's not get it twisted. These maps are for the conscious mind. The unconscious mind, from my experience, only knows the experience in its holistic form. And as a result of that, it looks at the map and goes, and I know that there's 50, 60 maps that I could put on reality. So it just knows what it knows up until that point based on the set of associations or meaning it's made to an experience up until that point. So it's a beautiful map, but it's just a map. And so I don't want to give it too much hype.
Well, let me qualify this as kind of a way of understanding what's going on in the regular world in regard to how people are forming their beliefs and how they're believing things like who's in charge, what's the authority, what's the news, all these kind of things that are going on. I think it's if it is just one map, it's a creation of a map that shows how the system is functioning to affect all of those different filters in a way that leads people to the beliefs and even the purposes. You know, because if people want to help people as a doctor, say, for example, there's a path that they assume is the way to become a doctor. And that's kind of been guided by the authorities in regard to what they call reality. But that's not really what reality is. And this is what I really want to get to the discussion of it. And, you know, I put together a couple videos, one from James Corbett on kind of propaganda, and another on from Truthstream Media on kind of this idea of where the technological heads are steering us in regard to these social credit scores and stuff, and kind of a guiding people into a particular perception. With that in mind, I'll just ask the question and then we'll go from there. But and I do believe you're right with the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. It's a back and forth. But we do feel I do believe that there's a conscious choice of what filter we choose to take as our own, and what all those.
Can
levels.
I jump in on that?
We have a choice to do that.
Well, I just wanted to point out. And
Bob,
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Okay.
I just wanted to point out that if we call the attention of the subconscious to the map that the conscious mind has created, and if we ask the subconscious to utilize that map in some specific way, the subconscious is always, in my experience, quite willing to do that. So there is a feedback loop that we are capable of that we don't usually utilize. And I think one of the key understandings of NLP, since that's our topic, one of the key understandings to really grasp it is this thing about feedback loops. They're very handy things. Without them, we go astray very quickly. We need feedback. Everybody needs feedback. So to me, the fact that we can manipulate those loops is key, absolutely essential to getting changes that are positive as opposed to changes that are entropic and dangerous. What do you think, Jonny? You agree with that?
I think that we're having a very profound and deep discussion. And I think that what I'm based on the videos that you brought up, Michael, and that is this. Our conscious mind's need to create these categories is the very nature of what creates power. These credit scores are literally a categorization. It's attempting to take humanity and put them into boxes in such a way as to influence its direction. The same as we would hope that we're using Diltz's neurological levels, or the map within us, in order to help influence and guide ourselves into a direction of desire or outcome. And so I don't see it as this big illogical leap. Like I kind of saw this social credit score thing coming, but we just weren't as blatant about its labeling. You know, were you the in crowd in the 70s? Did you wear bell bottoms? Did you rock that? You know, did you rock the newest trend then? In the 90s, did you sport a fanny pack? Are you wearing the coolest new fashions? Are you driving the coolest new cars? For me, those are still social credit scores. It's just not as defined now when it comes to setting someone up for the lack of information or awareness they may need in order to make a conscious decision as to a direction in society they would like to move in. So it's a bit more blatant, or the boundary lines are a bit more defined now. And in my perspective or point of view, it's easier to see the system, provided you're able to see it, which is the three of us have access to technology. We have access to books that we wanted to study. We had access to teachers that became available to us at critical key junctures in our lives. We might have even had access to parents and guides who asked us really cool questions or gave us cool thoughts at certain moments in time that allowed us to become aware of that. And this takes us back to our previous call where I said the greatest of human weaknesses is ignorance. And so the fact that the first video you sent that I loved, which is James Corbett, talking about the fact that there is science that has come out that people could become aware of that would pull the veil back on the Wizard of Oz and show the man behind the system. And the fact that there are zero news outlets presenting this information shows there is a hard boundary around, in my opinion, there's a hard boundary around who's supposed to be in the know and who's supposed to be ignorant and not being made aware of this information. And so, yes, Diltz's logical levels as a map could set an individual up to be paying attention to where these boundary lines may be set up, not just on a sociological level, but obviously on our own psychological level first. So that's my 2 cents or my take on it.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that. That's a wonderful answer. Bob, do you have anything in addition to that?
I'm really glad we're having this conversation. I'm looking forward to further conversations, especially, Jonny, with you. I have a lot of opportunity to talk to Michael, not as much to talk with you. You have very interesting things to say, and I see that we have a commonality in our interests that I would like to pursue. And we've just touched the surface, Michael. This has been the tip of the iceberg, and it's a good thing. You know, if you usually see the tip of the iceberg first before the rest. And I know there are flat earthers who would disagree with that, but screw that. So thank you for bringing us the tip of the iceberg here and for bringing us together. I'm sorry that Sterling wasn't here to do this with us. I'm sure he will have things to say, feedback for us on what we've presented here. Anyway, I thank you both. This has been most pleasant and instructive.
Me too. Michael, what are your thoughts on what Bob and I shared?
Ooh, good question.
Well,